your first assignment in CDC102 is to do a master copy shadow map. Now this is going to follow the same process as the CDC101 class with the bark plates. But again, as we mentioned in the introduction to this term, the difference primarily will be that you are going to have to start making decisions right in the beginning about your envelope and shadow map, as opposed to starting with an obvious outline and then filling in the shadow map. We're going to see something like, for example, this. This is a copy of a painting by William Bouguereau of two cherub babies. And so when we look at something like this, in its photocopied black and white form, we start to see how some of the shapes are getting lost, and some of the divisions between form are getting lost as well. And it's in some cases difficult to see where one shape ends and the other begins. Now, the tendency of most students and most beginners is to fill in that which they cannot see. So, for example, we have a master copy painting of some horses, and a lot of the feet of the horses disappear into shadows. And the students that typically pick that particular painting are those who like horses and are fans of horses and know a little bit about horses and horse anatomy. And so as they're doing this master copy, I see them drawing the feet in the bottom, which you cannot see in the painting because they're lost into this big shadow. There is no distinction between the hooves and the shadow surrounding, but they're drawing the outline of the foot. And I'll ask something like, well, how do you know that that's there? That's not the shape that's there. And they say, oh, well, I know what the foot looks like. And that's exactly what we have to get away from. If we're going to start thinking like a painter, we have to start fine-tuning our observational skills and thinking in abstract shapes of light and dark. We briefly mentioned before with the shadow map how we're going to squint and see lights and darks, and that's exactly what we're going to have to do as we work in here. You're going to select an area and then transfer that box and start to draw the light shape, and within that perhaps a shadow map of your master copy. And so it'll be kind of chaotic because sometimes the figure is not completely clear for those surroundings. And so you're going to have to, in that case, you're going to have to select, for example, a light shape and map that light shape out. Or select a dark shape like the hair here and map that dark shape out and start to build on top of it. If you have more of an isolated figure, we have some paintings also by Bouguereau of some portraits. And with the portrait, it's easy to see the shape of the head, and then there's features within the head. So in that case, it would make sense to start with a box, scheme, and envelope of the outer contours of the head, and then once that is successfully brought up, moving to the inside features of the face. But if you're dealing with something more complex, multifigural groupings, or horses, or a complex still life, it's going to make more sense, instead of starting with an individual object, it will make more sense to start with the abstract shapes that you can clearly see, either of light or of dark, and start to map those out. So this assignment, you're going to have 4 weeks on. You're going to have to make a decision, and this is where it becomes a little more challenging, about whether or not you're going to be boxing, scheming, and enveloping a subject and then building a shadow map inside, or starting by boxing, scheming, and mapping out some of the shapes of light or dark and just building it together like all these little puzzle pieces that are going to fit in. Keep in mind, to decide if it's going to be a light or a dark, we're going to squint way down, or we're going to use our reducing lens, or we're going to step way back at the back of the room. All of those are techniques that will allow you to see just the light and the dark pattern, the shadow map, or the notan. We don't want to end up mapping out too many sub-values early on because it'll just confuse us later, and we're probably going to have to rework that anyway. So we want to keep it really simple, just the lights and just the darks, and push them to whichever side will make for a more clear, understandable drawing. So for this, a student worked on this. You can see the box lines here and the scheme lines for the arm here. So the arm here was the first thing that was boxed in, and then that was rendered out, and then the face was also included on top of that as the next shape to start to tackle. But we can see the final drawing that the student ended up with. And this is a good amount of completion for 4 weeks of work. Again, we only have 2 to maybe 2.5 hours in this class each week, so we're looking at maybe 8 to 10 hours. So as far as just a shadow map, that's a good level of completion. You can see where he's starting to map out the difference between lights and darks. Even in the arm here, we've got this shape treated as a light, whereas this shape is treated as a dark. And for clarity's sake, he's defined the boundary between this arm and the arm underneath. So that's a decision you'll make. But keep in mind, you may end up losing the boundary between those shapes as we advance to the shading stage and finding it later on. So that's about the level of completion we're expecting to see. Keep in mind, it can get pretty confusing as you're building up this shadow map. To keep it clear, practice that's often used is to put little X's over any area you're intending to be thrusting into shadow. That way you have a clear understanding of what's going to be light and what's going to be dark before you would advance to the next stage. But for this assignment, we are just focusing on solely the shadow map. We're going to make black and white photocopies of painting, or if you're working at home, find a master copy, get it a good enough size for you to see and handle the shapes clearly, and print it out in black and white. We're going to build slowly to the ability to work from colorful objects and translate those values. But for now, we want to keep it as simple as possible, just a black and white reference, and we'll try to create as complete of a shadow map as possible. Again, if you're working at home, try to get the entire drawing shadow map completed. You will be turning these in after 4 weeks, and again, we're going to be focusing on accuracy of shape, line quality, and overall cleanliness of the entire drawing. We want to keep these nice and clean as possible. Learn to handle that willow really well. Another thing to keep in mind is we want to keep all of our lines on here straight. As we're building up an envelope and shadow map, we don't curve any lines. What may look like a curved line in this drawing is actually just a series of smaller straight lines. As we continue to break these shapes down and whittle them out more and more and more, all these straight lines tend to take on the appearance of a curved line from a distance. But the benefit of a straight line, of course, is that we can measure off of it objectively, and if there's a segment of this entire line that's not quite right, we can isolate that one segment, as opposed to a curved line. It's going to be much more challenging to do so. So keep all those lines nice and straight as you develop and continually refine your shadow.